Okay, it's Friday the 22nd of November, day one of our road trip, and we're just about to get started. Today we'll be travelling from our home here in Keilor Downs, Melbourne, to Ballarat, where my great-great-great-grandfather on my paternal side, William Dalton, and his wife Charlotte came to settle in 1852. William was born in South London, England in the year 1824, and at the age of 16 he was indicted for feloniously breaking and entering the dwelling house of one Henry Cordell and stealing therein 4 yards of ribbon valued at £1. For this he received 10 years of transportation to Van Diemen's Land. Here he met and married my great-great-grandmother, Charlotte Kittlety, in 1847. He was 22 years old, she was 19. Charlotte was the daughter of Solomon Kittlety, a free settler who, along with his wife and 10 children, travelled to Van Diemen's Land in 1833. It's unclear what William Dalton did for a living, but his convict records indicate he was a shoemaker by trade, which is quite interesting because after he'd served his sentence and married, he travelled to Geelong with his brother-in-law Solomon Kittlety Jr. and then on to Ballarat, where Solomon set up a bootmaking shop in the small town of Warren Heap. And that's where we're going to right now. Okay, so here we are outside the Warren Heap Primary School, about 5 kilometres east of Ballarat, just south of the Western Highway. When William Dalton and Solomon Kittlety arrived here, Ballarat was a bustling hub of activity, transformed from a quiet pastoral landscape of predominantly Irish farmers into a thriving gold mining town. This is a picture of Solomon Kittlety Jr. on the right, standing with his family outside his shop sometime around 1860, I'm guessing. Whether William Dalton joined his brother-in-law in this bootmaking enterprise is unclear. There's also no record I can find that he tried his hand at gold mining. The next record I have of William is of his sudden death at the rather young age of 40. And here we are on the banks of Lake Wendouree, Ballarat, where on the 16th of December 1864 my great-great-great-grandfather William Dalton suddenly died of an aneurysm. An article published in the Ballarat Star outlines the unusual circumstances surrounding William's untimely death. At about 11 o'clock he, William, was called upon by some friends to accompany them on a rowing excursion on the lake. Whilst the boat was being got ready, Dalton came behind James Edwards and Palmer as they stood on the jetty and laid his hands on their shoulders. He immediately fell backwards, but before he reached the floor of the jetty, which he did on his side, his fall was broken by Palmer. Dalton groaned a few times, foamed at the mouth and ground his teeth, but never spoke, and he expired in about a quarter of an hour. A surgeon was sent for, but Dalton was then quite dead." End quote. The high esteem at which my great-great-great-grandfather was held by the community was further outlined in an article by the Star which talks about the funeral of a fireman who was buried with something approaching a public funeral. Quote, "At 2 o'clock the fire bell of the Ballarat Fire Brigade began to toll and the members to collect. Shortly afterwards they were joined by the members of the Ballarat West Fire Brigade, and a little before 3 o'clock both repaired to St Paul's Church, where before the communion table the coffin was laid." And here we are outside St Paul's Church, where William Dalton's funeral took place on the 18th of December 1864. It also happens that William was the sexton of the church at the time of his death, as well as a member of several lodges that turned out in great numbers to pay their respects. The article goes on to say, quote, "The coffin was carried out by 6 of the deceased's fellow Fire Brigade men, and the procession formed in Victoria Road. Here was assembled a great number of people whom the spectacular character of the funeral had attracted, and the whole route was marked by a similar exhibition of public interest. As the procession descended Victoria Street, the brilliant uniforms of the brigades contrasting with the sombre garments of the members of the various lodges presented a decidedly picturesque appearance, and the effect would have been better had not the procession been so closely hemmed in by the crowd. 6 firemen of the Ballarat Fire Brigade carried the coffin of the deceased upon poles, and outside of them walked the pallbearers. Then followed a mourning coach containing the widow and children of the deceased and the Reverend Mr. Cummins. On reaching the boundary of the boroughs, the bell of the Ballarat West Fire Brigade began to toll, and on reaching the gates of the cemetery, the concourse of people attending the procession could not be short of 2,000 persons, a very large proportion of whom were females." End of quote. Not bad for a convict, eh? A further article in the same newspaper outlines how £169, 7 shillings and 4pence was raised from donations, enough to buy his widow Charlotte and 8 children a house for £66. 4 years after William's death, Charlotte married a Richard Ebensworthy. She ended up dying in Ballarat in 1902 from throat cancer. Charlotte and William's youngest child, George Dalton, my great-great-grandfather, was only 8 years old when his father died and would go on to marry my great-grandmother, Honora Curtis, in June 1874. I'll have a bit more to say about Honora and her parents a little later when we visit Warrnambool. For the next leg of our road trip, we'll be travelling nearly 270 kilometres from Ballarat to a little town called Harrow, located on the boundary of the West Wimmera and Southern Grampians, and which arguably claims to be Victoria's oldest inland settlement. This is where my great-great-grandfather on my mother's side, John Dorney, and his wife Ellen came to settle with their 8 children in 1834. Harrow is located on the banks of the Upper Glenelg River and was a major stopping off place for prospectors travelling from South Australia to the Ballarat goldfields in the mid-1850s. It is also the home of Australia's first cricket team, which happened to be all Aboriginal, which travelled to England and beat the Poms at their own game. This is an extraordinary tale of enduring, pioneering spirit, a meteoric rise to wealth, followed by a heart-wrenching downfall to financial ruin. And it's one I'm sure you'll find very interesting. So let's get going. We have a long trip in front of us. Okay, we're just coming into Stawell after travelling about 120 kilometres up the Western Highway from Ballarat. In the late 1850s, the discovery of gold-rich quartz veins led to the establishment of the town and the extraction of over 2,670,000 ounces of gold, today valued at nearly 12.5 billion Australian dollars. Stawell is one of a handful of Victorian towns that continue to support a working gold mine today, with some shafts reaching depths of up to 1.6 kilometres. It's also where my great-great-grandfather John Dorney, his daughter Mary and husband John Sheehan came to live in the 1870s. Unfortunately, we don't have time to stop and look around, but I'll be returning to talk more about John Dorney and his Stawell connection a little later in day 7 of our road trip series, But for now, we're heading down the road to Horsham. Well, here we are coming into Horsham, commonly referred to as the capital of the Wimmera and the centre of West Victoria's wheat and wool industry. This was also the stopover point for the gold escort that travelled from the Ballarat goldfields to Adelaide during the 1850s. From this point, we'll be roughly following the route of Major Thomas Mitchell, the first European to traverse this area in 1836. Mitchell led an expedition from Sydney, navigating along the Darling, Murray and Glenelg rivers until he reached Portland, where to his astonishment he discovered a European whaling station operated by the Henty brothers. Before we get to the coast, we'll be making a sharp left at Edenhope, which will take us to our first stopover at Harrow. Well, that was a fair drive for day one of our road trip, but we've finally made it to Harrow and looking forward to our first night sleeping in the camper van. It's going to be very hot tonight, so I hope the air conditioner's working well.